5 days without sleep does something terrible to the human mind. David Bowie stood in Victoria Station on that April morning in 1976, and he wasn't seeing fans anymore. He was seeing shadows, hearing voices, feeling the weight of invisible eyes watching his every move. 3 grams of cocaine per day had become his normal intake. His body weight had dropped to 95 pounds. The mirrors in his Los Angeles home had been covered because he could no longer bear to see his own reflection. And now, back in London, for what was supposed to be a triumphant homecoming, he found himself trapped in a moment that would haunt him for decades. When his hand rose to acknowledge the crowd, Bowie wasn't thinking about politics or symbolism or controversy. He was thinking about survival, about making it through one more public appearance without collapsing, without revealing just how close to madness he had come. But the photographers saw something else entirely. The British press, always hungry for scandal, would transform his gesture into a symbol of something far darker. And the man who had spent his career breaking boundaries and challenging conventions would suddenly find himself accused of embracing the very fascism he had always rejected. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe to our channel now. Because what happened next would force Bowie to flee England forever. The character arrived without warning in late 1975, and those who knew David Bowie began to worry almost immediately. The Thin White Duke wasn't like Ziggy Stardust or Aladdin's Sane. Those were costumes he could remove at the end of the night. The Duke was something else entirely, something that lived inside him, something he couldn't control. Bowie described him as a very Aryan fascist type, a would-be romantic with no emotions at all. But what terrified those closest to him was the realization that Bowie wasn't playing a character anymore. He was becoming one. In Los Angeles, Bowie lived in a mansion that had become a prison. The windows were covered with blackout curtains because he believed photographers were watching him from the hills. He kept the refrigerator stocked with nothing but milk and red peppers, convinced this diet would purify his system while the cocaine poisoned it. His daily routine had collapsed into chaos. He would stay awake for 4, 5, sometimes 6 days straight, fueled by endless lines of white powder, his mind racing through occult books and conspiracy theories. Friends who visited described a man who had lost his grip on reality, someone who spoke in whispers about demonic forces and magical rituals, someone who had drawn pentagrams on the floor and conducted ceremonies he barely understood. The recording sessions for Station to Station became legendary for all the wrong reasons. Engineers would arrive at the studio to find Bowie already there, having never left from the previous day. His eyes were hollow, his cheekbones protruding so sharply they cast shadows on his face. He weighed less than many teenage girls, his suit pants held up with safety pins because belts no longer worked. But somehow, impossibly, he was creating music that would be considered among his finest work. The title track ran over 10 minutes, and Bowie recorded it in takes that seemed to channel something beyond his deteriorating physical state. Producer Harry Maslin watched in amazement and horror as Bowie would nail vocal performances on the first or second take, his voice strong despite the fact that his hands shook between recordings. The paradox was maddening. How could someone so broken create something so perfect? The answer was that Bowie wasn't creating the album. The Thin White Duke was. And the Duke was feeding on Bowie's destruction. What the public didn't know was the depth of his descent into occultism during this period. Bowie had become obsessed with Aleister Crowley, the British occultist, who had died in 1947, the same year Bowie was born. This coincidence had taken root in his cocaine-paranoid mind as something meaningful, something that connected him to darker forces. He spent thousands of dollars on rare occult texts, studying Crowley's writings on magic and consciousness expansion. He practiced rituals designed to summon entities, drew elaborate sigils in his notebooks, and spoke seriously about astral projection and demonic possession. His assistant, Corinne Schwab, became increasingly concerned as she watched him deteriorate. She would find him at dawn, hunched over ancient books, muttering about magical formulas and secret societies. He told her once that he had successfully projected his consciousness out of his body and seen London from above. Whether this was genuine mystical experience or cocaine-induced hallucination became impossible to distinguish. The Duke character became the vessel for all of this darkness. On stage during the station-to-station tour, Bowie performed with an almost robotic precision, his movements sharp and angular, his voice devoid of warmth. He wore simple black and white suits, abandoning the glitter and theatrical costumes of his previous personas. The staging was stark, harsh white lighting, minimal props, a lone microphone stand, and his between-song patter grew increasingly disturbing. He would speak about Superman and Nietzsche's Übermensch, about the need for strong leaders and the weakness of democracy. Audience members who had come expecting Ziggy's playful androgyny instead witnessed something cold and frightening. Music journalists began to question these philosophical tangents. Was Bowie making an artistic statement about fascism, or was he genuinely expressing these views? Years later, he would say, "I was out of my mind, totally crazed. The main thing I was functioning on was mythology, and that was dangerously over the edge." But in 1976, there was no distance, no perspective, no safety net between the character and the man. The decision to return to England in April 1976 was driven by multiple factors. Bowie hadn't performed in his home country in over 2 years, and his British fans were desperate to see him. The Station to Station album had reached number 5 on the UK charts. But there was another, darker reason for the trip. Bowie was beginning to realize that Los Angeles was killing him. The city's endless sunshine felt like an accusation, exposing his skeletal frame to harsh judgment. The music industry parties where cocaine was served as casually as champagne had become a trap he couldn't escape. England represented a potential escape, a chance to reconnect with something real. So he agreed to the promotional tour, a series of interviews and public appearances designed to promote the album. The journey back was itself a nightmare. Bowie flew from Los Angeles to New York, where he spent 2 days in a hotel room, unable to face the street outside. His cocaine supply was running low, and the thought of being without it triggered panic attacks. On the plane to London, he sat in first class behind dark sunglasses, barely eating, refusing to sleep because sleep had become impossible without pharmaceutical assistance. When he arrived at Heathrow Airport, the flash of cameras and screaming fans triggered something primal in him. He was escorted through the terminal by security, his gait unsteady, his face a mask of barely controlled terror. The British press noted his appearance with growing concern. Photos from the airport showed a man who looked decades older than his 29 years. The promotional appearance at Victoria Station was planned as a simple affair. Bowie would arrive in an open-top Mercedes, wave to fans, sign a few autographs, and depart for a press conference. The entire event was expected to last no more than 15 minutes. What the organizers didn't anticipate was the sheer number of fans who would show up. By mid-morning on May 2nd, 1976, Victoria Station had become barely controlled chaos. Thousands of fans packed the station's forecourt. Police struggled to maintain order as the crowd pressed against barriers. And into this powder keg came David Bowie, a man who had not slept in 5 days and whose grip on reality had become tenuous at best. The Mercedes carrying Bowie made its way slowly through the crowds, surrounded by police motorcycles and security. Bowie stood in the back of the convertible, one hand gripping the car's frame to steady himself. He was wearing his thin white Duke uniform, a plain white shirt, black vest, and black trousers. His hair was slicked back, emphasizing the sharp angles of his face. Even from a distance, those who knew him could see that something was terribly wrong. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical. As the car inched forward, the crowd's roar grew louder. Bowie had performed for crowds of tens of thousands during his career, but this was different. There was no stage to separate him from the masses, no theatrical lighting to obscure his condition. He was exposed, vulnerable, and terrified in a way that no one in that crowd could possibly understand. What happened next occurred so quickly that most people present wouldn't understand its significance until they saw the photographs in the next day's newspapers. As the Mercedes came to a halt near the station entrance, Bowie steadied himself and prepared to acknowledge the crowd. His mind, operating on 5 days of forced wakefulness and 3 grams of daily cocaine, was processing information in a fractured way. The faces in the crowd seemed to blur and multiply. The noise was overwhelming. He could feel his heart racing, adrenaline mixing with the chemicals already flooding his system. Everything felt simultaneously hyper-real and completely unreal. His right hand rose from his side in what he experienced as a simple gesture of acknowledgement. In his mind, he was waving to the fans, thanking them for their support. But something went wrong in the translation between intention and execution. Whether it was the angle of his arm, the stiffness of his cocaine-restricted muscles, or the particular moment the photographers chose to capture, the gesture that resulted was ambiguous at best and horrifying at worst. His arm extended upward at approximately a 45-degree angle, his hand open but rigid, and for approximately 3 seconds, he held this position. To Bowie, these 3 seconds were an eternity of discomfort and confusion. To the photographers clustered at the front of the crowd, those 3 seconds were a gift beyond measure. Their cameras captured the moment from multiple angles, none of them yet realizing they had just documented what would become one of the most controversial images in rock and roll history. What the cameras recorded was subject to interpretation and interpretation. In 1976, Britain was heavily influenced by historical memory. World War II had ended only 31 years earlier, and the wounds were still fresh in the British consciousness. The image of the Nazi salute was seared into the national psyche as the ultimate symbol of evil. When the photographs from Victoria Station were developed and examined by newspaper editors, several showed an image that was impossible to ignore. David Bowie, standing in an open-top car, his right arm raised at an angle that looked disturbingly similar to the fascist salute. The context that would have explained the image, the exhaustion, the addiction, the simple intention to wave, was invisible to the camera. What remained was a single frozen moment that seemed to tell a very different story. The first newspaper to run the photograph was the New Musical Express. They placed it on the front page under the headline, "Heil and Farewell," with a question mark that did little to soften the accusation. Other papers quickly followed. Within 24 hours, the photograph had become a national scandal. Radio shows debated whether Bowie was a secret Nazi sympathizer. Television news programs analyzed the gesture frame by frame. The Jewish community in London expressed outrage and demanded an apology. Rock critics who had championed Bowie's previous work now questioned whether they had been wrong about him all along, and Bowie himself, sequestered in his London hotel room, slowly began to realize that he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Within 2 weeks of the Victoria Station incident, Bowie had made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life and career. He would leave England immediately, and he would not return for several years. More dramatically, he would leave Los Angeles as well. His destination was Berlin, specifically West Berlin, the divided city that existed as a strange island of Western culture surrounded by communist East Germany. The choice was deliberate and symbolic. Berlin in 1976 was a city still haunted by its Nazi past, still physically divided by the wall that represented the ideological split of the Cold War. It was a place where history's weight was visible on every street corner. By moving there, Bowie was confronting the very imagery that had destroyed his reputation in Britain. He was also seeking a place where he could disappear, where he could live anonymously and begin the long process of recovering from his cocaine addiction. He moved into a 7-room apartment in Schöneberg, a working-class neighborhood. The apartment was Spartan: plain walls, minimal furniture, no elaborate recording equipment. Bowie deliberately chose this simplicity as part of his recovery strategy. He wanted to strip away everything that had enabled his Los Angeles lifestyle. His daily routine in Berlin was radically different. He would wake early, eat a proper breakfast for the first time in years, and spend hours walking through the city. He visited museums and galleries, studying German expressionist art. He rode the U-Bahn like an ordinary commuter, often unrecognized because his skeletal Los Angeles appearance was already changing as he began to eat regular meals. And slowly, painfully, with the help of his assistant Coco, he reduced and eventually eliminated his cocaine use. Bowie didn't face this transformation alone. Shortly after moving to Berlin, he was joined by Iggy Pop, who was dealing with his own severe heroin addiction. The two men had become friends in Los Angeles. When Bowie decided to flee to Berlin, he invited Iggy to join him, partly out of genuine concern, and partly because having someone else to care for would help him stay focused on his own recovery. They moved into the apartment together. By day, they lived like monks, following strict routines designed to keep them away from drugs. They would wake early, cook breakfast together, and go for long bicycle rides through Berlin. By night, they would descend into the city's legendary underground club scene, drinking beer and absorbing the raw creative energy. This combination of discipline and controlled hedonism provided exactly what both men needed. In the fall of 1976, Bowie began work on what would become the Low album. The album was recorded partly in France and partly at Hansa Studios in Berlin, in a building that sat in the shadow of the Berlin Wall. Producer Tony Visconti was shocked by the transformation when he first saw him. The skeletal figure from Los Angeles had filled out slightly, and most importantly, the manic energy had subsided. Bowie was clear-headed and focused in a way Visconti hadn't seen in years, but he was also profoundly depressed, dealing with the emotional aftermath of his addiction and the Victoria Station scandal. This combination of clarity and melancholy became the foundation for Low's unique sound. The album was divided into 2 sections: short, fragmented songs on the first side, and entirely instrumental pieces on the second. When RCA Records first heard it, they were horrified and tried to prevent its release. But Bowie insisted, and when Low was released in January 1977, it slowly gained recognition as a masterpiece. It wasn't until 1980, 4 years after the Victoria Station incident, that Bowie finally offered a full explanation of what had happened. In an interview with New Musical Express, he spoke openly about his cocaine addiction for the first time, describing the extent of his drug use and the way it had distorted his thinking. He admitted that during the Los Angeles period, he had made statements and explored ideas that he now found reprehensible. He acknowledged that the Victoria Station gesture, while not intended as a Nazi salute, had occurred within a larger context of fascination with authoritarian imagery. Most importantly, he offered a genuine apology. The confession was remarkable for its honesty, and it marked a turning point in how the British public viewed the incident. But the damage from that single moment could never be fully erased. The photograph from Victoria Station would follow Bowie for the rest of his career, resurfacing in documentaries and biographies. Bowie himself seemed to view it as both a warning and a reminder. In later interviews, when young musicians would ask him about creativity and drug use, he would reference that period and emphatically discourage them from following his path. He would tell anyone who asked that cocaine hadn't made him more creative. It had nearly killed him and destroyed everything he had built. The Victoria Station incident created a clear dividing line in Bowie's career. Before 1976, he was the chameleonic pop star, the master of reinvention. After 1976, he was something else, a survivor, an artist who had looked into the abyss of self-destruction and chosen life instead. The Berlin Trilogy established him as a serious artist whose work transcended pop music trends. And when he eventually returned to more accessible pop music, he did so with a perspective that came from having survived his own worst impulses. The scandal also taught Bowie about the line between artistic provocation and genuine harm. This realization made him more thoughtful in his later work. He continued to explore challenging themes, but he did so with greater awareness of consequences. Today, more than 4 decades after that April morning at Victoria Station, the incident occupies a complex place in David Bowie's legacy. The photograph has become iconic in a way its subjects never intended. For younger generations discovering Bowie's music, the Victoria Station incident is often their introduction to the darker chapters of his story. And perhaps that's the most important lesson, that we are all capable of losing ourselves, of crossing lines we never imagined crossing. What matters is not whether we make those mistakes, but what we do afterward, whether we have the courage to face what we've done and the discipline to change. David Bowie stood at Victoria Station with his hand raised in a gesture that would haunt him for years, and he couldn't have known that this moment would become the foundation of his greatest transformation. The Thin White Duke died in Berlin, and from that death came decades of sobriety and creativity, came a legacy that would inspire generations.